Look at all this free wood I got from my wood supplier. They gave it to me in exchange for me making something for them. So let's see what I can make with this.
These were a bunch of exotic woods. I had coconut, mawa, African mahogany, and teak. And the hard part was trying to figure out what to do. After some consultation with my daughter, her creative juices got flowing. She liked the coconut the best, so we decided to take the coconut, cut it into blocks, and glue it together so that the end grain became the centerpiece of the board. Once we got those glued together, we started cutting thin strips. I used the thin strip jig on my table saw, as you can see there, and I decided maybe I should try and use my bandsaw. So I went over to the bandsaw and started to try and cut thin strips on the bandsaw, and it did a fairly good job. I can't say I'd like the bandsaw better than the table saw, but I do have both options. Now, cutting the strips on the bandsaw, as you know, creates a little bit of a rough edge, so I took the strips over to the sander and I sanded them nice and smooth. Then the creative process of what kind of shape do I want to cut out of that center coconut piece. I laid out some lines on a scrap piece of wood, molded over, bent some pieces, looked at it again, bent some pieces, and I finally came up with the shape that I wanted to cut. I took that scrap piece over to the bandsaw, cut out the shape that I had come up with so I could see how it would look. I set that on top of the coconut to make sure things would fit, and then I checked the thin strips to make sure they would bend to the curves that I had done. After I was satisfied with the way things would fit, I traced it onto the main coconut piece and cut it out at the bandsaw. You may have noticed that at each end of my shape it comes to a point. My experience working with this coconut was that it's rather friable, and I wanted to make sure that when I put it into the main cutting board, it came to a point and was surrounded by hardwood. Then I sanded it with the drum sander there on my drill press. I just wanted to get good smooth edges. Once again, as you know, with the bandsaw, you do end up with sort of a rough edge. So this was just smoothing out the curves and making things nice and fluid. Now off camera, I took two 2x4s and glued them together to make this piece you see here. This is going to be a temporary piece that I'm going to use for clamping purposes. I temporarily glued the coconut to these pieces and then used the foam pieces you see there as spacers. The foam pieces represent the thickness of the thin strips that I'm going to be gluing into this. So that way I could cut along the line here and have a clamping piece that would force the thin strips up into the curve properly. I didn't have to cut exactly on these lines. Once again, the foam forms were just an approximation of how thick the thin strips would be, but I did want it to be very close so that I could get good clamping pressure.
Okay, well, I've got my thin strips soaked in water for 24 hours. Now I'm going to put them into this form that I made to form them to my piece, let them dry for a couple days, and then we'll glue them up. Could have made my thin strips just a wee bit longer over at this end, but I think we'll be okay. It's just going to be really close. I've had this in clamps for about 4 days now, letting the water dry out of these thin strips. So now I'm going to take it apart and let the thin strips dry a little bit more, number them, make sure they're in the right spot, and go from there. So I wanted to point out, just looking at this, you see how these strips have dark spots in the middle? That's where it's still damp. So even after 4 days of being in the clamps, that's how much moisture stayed in those pieces. All right, so we're gonna let this dry for another day or two, and then we'll clamp or glue and clamp, yeah. All right, well, I've let the thin strips dry several days, and I find it fascinating that they have relaxed so much. So it'll be interesting. I'm gonna try a dry fit here, dry clamping before I go gluing, and make sure I don't bust anything in the process. All right, well, seems to be okay. Dry fit. Time to get the glue out and glue her up. Uh-oh. That wasn't supposed to happen. A little wedging right there. Yeah. Just a little bit of glue squeezing in those areas, I think. Okay. Step 1 done. I've got the thin strips glued to the main coconut piece here. Now I'm going to trim off these long ends here, and then I'm going to take my strips that I've been soaking in water and press them onto here like I did the first set, let them dry for several days, come back and glue them. So it's been about 24 hours since I put these into the clamps to let them dry. Now, last time I did this, I let it sit for like 3 days and it was still damp in between all these small slats. So I'm going to do something a little different today. I'm going to take it out of the clamps for about an hour, and then I'm going to put it back into the clamps and see how that helps. So let's give that a try.
I forgot to record a follow-up to that piece. I did try it and it worked okay. I can't say it was spectacular, but it did work okay. So then I went on to gluing it up.
So I got this all glued up, as you can see, and as I was gluing it up I ran into a problem where these strips slipped just a little bit up and down. So I don't know if you can see that there, but these are a little bit higher than this surface, and of course on the opposite side a little bit lower. And I was trying to figure, how do I get the two surfaces square to each other? So what I've come up with is I need this to be my surface that I reference square for the next step. What I'm going to do is I made this jig here, and I'm going to place this in the jig and secure it with some CA glue, masking tape, etc. shims. And then I'm going to advance my sanding disc quill here ever so slightly and make multiple passes through until things are nice and square. We'll see how this works out.
So while that worked out pretty good, it wasn't exactly perfect, and I felt I needed this to be as close to perfect as I could get. So I decided to pull out my flush trim bit on my router and run it along the one edge that was furthest in and trim off just a little bit. You'll see it trim off here in just a minute. With the two edges square to the first face, I then ran it through the planer so that the other face was parallel. Then came the hardest part of this project, trying to match those curves with a straight grain piece that had straight sides on it. I cut a couple templates out of some plywood and sanded them very carefully to match the curves as close as I could. There are methods with the router for doing complementary curves, and I looked at that and I tried it and I just couldn't get it to work for my situation. So I decided to lay it out by hand, and with my templates I sanded them very carefully, and it took several hours to get the templates just right. After I had the templates right, then I started laying them out on this piece of teak. Now my goal was to have the lines of the joints between the coconut perpendicular to the grain of the wood on the teak. So I laid out a line on my template that was exactly perpendicular, well, okay, as close as I could get. And then I set those templates on the teak there, and I carefully traced them so that I could have everything as close to perpendicular as possible. Then it was back to the bandsaw to cut out the rough shapes so that I could apply the template and finish it off at the router table with a flush trim bit. Then I used the super glue and masking tape method to apply the template to the piece of wood.
Yeah, pretty good. Little bit right there. Little bit right there. I think this is gonna turn out nice.
Now that I got the hard part done, I went on to milling up a little more coconut. You can see how out of square this particular piece was before I started running it through the jointer. These are going to be the pieces that I'm using on either side of the teak. I started cutting it to length, and then I remembered how friable it is, and splintering was going to happen if I used it on my miter saw without my zero clearance backer bar there. So I set up the backer bar, and that reduced the splintering to almost nothing. After getting the center part of the cutting board trimmed to the approximate length, leaving it just a little bit long, I pulled out some bloodwood as the final edging pieces and cut those to length. At this point, once again, it was not completely flat, so I took the belt sander and made it as flat as I possibly could. After I had that one face flattened, I ran it through the planer to get a good flat face on the opposite side. Then all that was left was trimming it to length. As I noted earlier, there were a couple spots where it didn't fit quite perfect, so I went with the glue and sawdust method to repair those hairline cracks. Then I sanded it, branded it, and let my daughter have the honors of putting the oil on it.
What the heck am I gonna do with all this wood? Or I could do the, wow, got all this wonderful free wood, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. Let's see what we can do. Wait till you see what I do with all this wood. So I was out at the lumber yard buying some exotic wood, and talking with the guys, I showed them some of my pictures and I said, I like building stuff like this. They said, would you like to trade some free wood for free stuff? And I said, no. No. Cut that. I got some free wood from my wood supplier here, and they gave it to me in exchange for me making something for them to sell in their shop. Let's see what I can make. Oh! Alright, take 2. Alright, take number 3. I'm gonna take you surfing with me. Come on, that baby, see. I'm gonna take you surfing with me.